Hello and welcome back to the Comic Books Matter podcast. I'm your host Jesse, and with me today is a guest I'm very excited about. He's the writer of Catwoman, Swamp Thing, and Justice League Dark at DC, Gaffney's Wall at Dark Horse, These Savage Shores at Vault, Blue and Green at Image, and new to me, discovered while I was doing some research, Quake Champions by Titan Comics. It's Rom V.
Hey everyone. Good to be here.
Rom, how did you write Quake Champions comic for for Titan? How did that come about?
So back when I was just starting out, I think 2016, Black Mamba had come out, and it was kind of the first thing that was opening doors for me here and there. I'm based in London, and so I know the Titan guys fairly well, and at the time we were just talking to the editors there and seeing if there were titles available that we could contribute on, and they got in touch with me for whatever reason. They thought I would be an apt choice for writing the Quake tie-in, and the writer's studio that I was hanging out with, they had all done video game comics, like Dan Waters and Alex Packnadel had done Assassin's Creed, and I think Ryan O'Sullivan had done Warhammer, and so I didn't want to feel left out. So I said, okay, I have to do a video game comic as well. And I'd played Quake back when I was just starting to pick up gaming, and Quake 3 was big, and Quake Arenas was big. So I suppose there was an element of nostalgia as well, and I just kind of wanted to see what it was like to write stories for a property that I hadn't thought of from scratch.
Yeah, and with Quake, I know there's lore to Quake and there's story to Quake, but how much did you get to add to the mythos of it all?
I mean, to be honest, there's lore to Quake, but it's all the bare minimum lore you need to jump into a suit and go out and shoot other players.
Yeah.
And so we had these characters, and we had like one paragraph descriptions of what their possible origins were, but really everything beyond that was kind of up to me to build and develop. So did that, went back to we had back and forth with the Quake Eddie Games crew, and so those guys had inputs on what we could and couldn't do with the lore, but outside of that, you know, right, it was pretty much building the whole thing off of one paragraph descriptions.
That's that, and that is something that's just kind of amazing when it comes to writers in general. As I see, like whenever they have to jump into a world that's not their own, pulling all these things from different areas and expanding upon them is so like inspiring in a lot of ways, because it just shows that like it takes a lot to build your own worlds, but then to build on someone else's too, it takes a different set of those skills. And yeah, it's just really
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, to be honest, it's funny because I was talking about I get this reaction from my wife a lot when I show her stories or outlines that I've written up, and she always goes like, "How do you come up with this shit? Like, this is so weird and so complex. How do you just come up with it from scratch?" And to be frank, I don't have the answer to that, and I think
Yeah.
I think a lot of writers are doing, or they do what they do. A lot of storytellers do what they do because their brains are wired to do that on some level, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to a lot of times. So you kind of just sit there, and everything you consume kind of gestates in your brain for a long time until something new pops out and you're like, oh, I can write about that. I can do something with that. And it's just an amalgamation of everything you kind of consumed, and it like a stew inside your brain making something new for you to work on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everyone does that to an extent. I suppose the difference between writers and people who consume these things and don't write, I suppose, is the outlandish notion that, oh, I can do something with it and other people will pay me to do it.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And that kind of goes back to what's so fascinating between your independent and your stuff at DC currently is you can feel that you're doing the same kind of creativity with both. Like with some people with their independence and then their big two company stuff, it feels like they're very much like they're doing the Marvel method, the Marvel way, and they're doing Marvel characters, and then in their independent, they're doing all the weird stuff they want to do. But for you, it feels like no, I can do both, and
Right.
they're gonna be equally as fun for everybody, and I don't have to worry about trying to either hit the right marks at DC or try to be weirder in my independent stuff. No, they're equally me through and through, and I think that's really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that has more to do with my approach to telling stories. Like, I didn't get my crack at DC because I was nice to someone or that I was friends with someone. I got my crack in there because I got my crack at telling stories because um, of my work in Black Mamba and in
Mm-hmm.
Paradiso, and I had sent them to editors, and they read those books and they liked it. So the way I see it, I was hired because of what I do on my creator-owned books, and so why would I do anything different
Yeah,
for things that are not my creator-owned books?
with the approach to like Catwoman versus like Swamp Thing, they're two different, like wildly different characters in the set of like power sets or like skill sets and things like that, and even characters they
Hmm.
interact with. Do you approach them with different? I mean, mindsets for sure, but like different angles that you're like, okay, Swamp Thing has to be dealt only in this sense, and Catwoman has to be dealt in only in this sense, or do they kind of be like, no, everybody can be dealt the same way, and let me just explore those aspects? Like, can you add magic to Catwoman and feel like this is a natural progression, versus Swamp Thing maybe getting himself into a heist at some point?
Right. Um, to an extent, um, but I also think those characters come with their own expectations,
Mm-hmm.
and unless you're going to subvert those expectations, just constantly defying them becomes trickery, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I'd much rather focus on telling a good story than telling a story that's cleverly different from in some way from the expectations of that character. Like, different is good, but different for its own sake is just trickery. It's just
yeah,
cleverness, and that doesn't interest me. It has to be different in a way that resonates with the character, right? So the reason these characters are interesting, and these characters are so successful in terms of their popularity is because they have the weight of history behind them.
mm-hmm.
And I suppose it would be a mistake to be reverential to that history, but it would equally be a mistake to not be cognizant of it.
Yeah,
Like, Catwoman works because she's a cat burglar, and if you move away from the cat burglar element of it, then you're being clever, but you're kind of missing the point of writing that character.
yeah,
Um, so that's my view on it, and I'm sure other writers will have their own takes on it. But if I'm gonna write a character and I'm gonna do something interesting, different, but like I've got an ongoing Swamp Thing coming up in March this year, and we are doing some significantly different things with it compared to what has been done with the character before. But we're not moving away from what I think the inner ethos of that character is.
yeah.
And so yeah, I suppose it's a question of the balance between the two.
And I feel like with Catwoman and Swamp Thing, like since they've had so many distinct runs beforehand, that you have these walls that have built the house that you're playing in now, and if you knock down all the walls, the roof's just going to cave in, right? So
I
you
mean,
have,
you wanna knock down walls that make the house look better.
yeah,
You don't want to knock down walls just because you've got a sledgehammer in your
yeah,
hand, you know?
exactly. And that brings me kind of to Justice League Dark, because this is, if my my memory serves me right, this is the third run of Justice League Dark,
Hmm.
um, like third volume of it. And so for every character inside Justice League Dark is very established on their own, but as a team, it feels like this is still something that's very much being built upon still.
Right.
So for you, do you feel kind of free and with that team dynamic to feel like, oh, this is something I can fully just go weird and wild with and not have to worry about people's expectations overall, because there's not a lot enough beforehand to kind of accidentally break. Does that make sense?
I don't worry as much about breaking. I worry more about like, okay, what am I building going forward? I don't care about breaking. I care more about why am I breaking stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so when I came into Justice League Dark, there was already an ongoing storyline, and so I didn't break anything there, as far as I could help it, to be honest, because I felt, readers had invested their time and energy into reading 19 issues, and I was going to, tell that complete story in 8 more issues, um, and so kind of my personal reinventions and ideas could wait until I had told those issues.
Yeah.
And I also think James Tynan, who was writing it then, had set up a really interesting story, and so kind of seeing it through to its finish was an interesting challenge in itself, to go like, okay, can I come in at the third act and still stick the landing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
um, and hopefully I did that. And then going forward, starting March, I think again the stories and the team are going to be radically different. Not in that I'm switching the characters out or I'm taking out popular characters from the team or anything of that sort, but the way we treat the team, the way that the stories are told around the team is going to be drastically changing. I question, okay, it's a team book,
Yeah.
but the point of these stories is that there is a larger world that this team occupies, and
Yeah.
that this team is playing within, and kind of my take on the stories that came before was that this is all cool, but it's all centered around the team and their personal
Hmm.
struggles, and we never get to see the ramifications of what they're doing kind of impinging on the world around them. um, and I wanted to do that. I wanted the stories to stop being so solipsistic in that they're preoccupied with their characters and their characters' struggles with magic. Um, so I think going forward from March, I've already written 6 or 7 of these 10 pagers. Those 10 pagers are wild. They go all over the world. There are characters that come in just for 2 issues and leave, and then there are characters that appear in issue 1 and don't show up again until issue 5, but everything they've been doing in between suddenly matters to the story. So
Yeah.
so um, and I think part of my motivation behind doing that is it creates this sense of wonderment. It creates this sense of scale that you go like, oh, even though I've not been reading about this character in these past 40 pages, I know that they've been doing something else. And so my mind is imagining what they've been doing without it necessarily being on the page. And I think there's a joy in reading stories like that.
Yeah.
Especially when I was younger, I remember reading stories like that and enjoying them for that reason.
And as a fan, I really hope I see Blue Devil somewhere in these. But uh, I remember you tweeting out at some point that you like grew up watching the animated universe, the like Justice League, Batman,
Mm-hmm.
the Superman, like the Bruce Timm and that universe,
Yeah,
like. And I when you were saying that, I was thinking about Justice League Unlimited, how we got to see the villains kind of move at the same time the heroes did from a lot of
right,
that,
right.
and it created such a bigger dynamic in that show to see
Yeah,
the villains doing their plots at the same time the league is doing something else, and
right.
eventually they're going to come to a head, but you get to see the world is actually functioning instead of
Yeah,
just focused on the heroes heroing around.
yeah, absolutely. And another case in point. I recently watched Mandalorian, because
Mm-hmm.
everyone was talking about it, and I was like, okay, fine, I give in, I'll watch it. And I think that's the thing they do really well, is that even though the episodes are focused on these two characters that we have predominantly, um, you always come back to older characters and you realize that they've been doing something off screen while the story has been going on. So there's this whole sense of scale built up through that. And I think that's part of the reason that that's successful is that you get this kind of holistic view of the world changing as your characters go through their stories.
Yeah, or like why Rogue One was so popular when it came out because it gave a different perspective on Episode Four, and like
Yeah,
these are the people doing all the dirty work to get to where we are in Episode Four.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that and that's super fascinating. I mean, that Justice League Dark has been one of my favorite team books of
hmm
recent, and I mean I read quite a few, and so I'm excited to see.
Oh man, it's gonna be wild. I shared some of my plans with Brian Bendis,
Uh
who's
huh.
writing the Justice League stories that go alongside. And it was my first time kind of talking with him and sharing some of these plans, and to see the kind of excitement in his eyes when he reacts to plot points in my story. I was like, okay, cool. If I can if I can get somebody who's been writing comics for years to still get excited about story beats, I must be doing all right. I must be doing all right.
Yeah, and that's what's so exciting about having you take over these like these special characters for so many people at the is like you are breathing such a fresh life into them that some people haven't felt since like Catwoman, like when Brubaker was on, or Swamp Thing,
Right.
back on Alan Moore. Like people are just so excited and jazzed for these characters again. It's really fascinating to watch.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I'm glad, and you know, um, part of me still that kind of 13, 14-year old who started writing stories, imagining one day I'm going to be a writer. And I didn't get to do that for the longest time because I was studying to be a chemical engineer, and then I worked as a chemical engineer for a while. Um, and so now that I'm getting to do it, there's that sort of inner child who's been sort of locked away for years, who's now getting to come out and go like, okay, what's next?
yeah, and that's exciting to hear that that's how you feel writing this, because I think that's how everybody hopes that the writers feel like. Because sometimes you get the feeling like, is this writer just kind of putting in the motions for this book? But like we hope that they're excited as we are, because they're like, these are the heroes. I get to play with these heroes and I get to do these things with them. When you were talking to Bendis, did he go like, hey, maybe we can team up and like I can add this element to my story and stuff, or are you
I
guys
can't
keeping
I
a very
can't
you can't talk about that at all?
I can't reveal secret plans that are being made. Sorry.
I'm excited though that there is a possibility of a crossover in the future.
Right, right. Yeah, keep an eye out for it.
To talk about some of your independent stuff, Blue and Green was easily one of my favorite graphic novels that I read last year. As someone who didn't have an appreciation for jazz until about college, and then really just getting wildly exposed to it, and then like diving headfirst into all kinds of areas of it. It was something kind of magical when I first read it, because it's such a beautiful illustration of muses and passion for art, and how it can all go all consuming, which a lot of jazz artists had that happen. They kind of got lost in uh the music and the scene of it all, and like there's so many that we don't know what happened to them because they got lost in that world and kind of disappeared. And it's so fascinating to see a comic book kind of take that in a horror approach. And I was just curious, like where did that idea kind of start, and did you guys like sit on it for a long time, or did you just go head first into it?
2018 Seattle Comic Con is where that idea started. Actually, it was after the Comic Con. I had grown tired of kind of spending the whole day in this massive crowd, and I was like, look, I need to go somewhere else where there aren't so many people around and just have some time to myself. And so I went to a bar that was near the venue, and they had a live band playing. And so I sat there and I had dinner and I listened to the whole thing, and I was maybe one of 15 other people there. It wasn't a huge crowd. When they took a break, their bassist came up and I sat down at the bar next to me. I bought him a drink, and we started talking about music and what I did, which was, I said, I'm a writer. And at some point we said it's interesting because good jazz and good writing are both trying to do the same things. And he
Mm-hmm.
went, how so? And I said, well, you're taking conventional notes, but putting them in unconventional ways and trying to reach for an emotion and a feeling that you can't quite articulate outside of the music. Like you can listen to a lot of kind of pop music or classical music and go, oh, this is a happy tune, or this
Mm-hmm.
is a sad tune, or this is an angry tune. You can't quite do that with jazz. Jazz tends to have like, this is happy, but it's also sad and playful. This is haunting, but it's also really joyful at times. So you get these kind of weird, complex emotions. And if you think about it, writing does the same thing,
Yeah.
in that you're trying to use conventional words to try and reach for an emotion or a feeling that you cannot articulate in a or encapsulate in a single descriptive sentence or a word outside of the story that you're telling. Um, and really, at that point, there was an inkling of doing this story in my head. Um, and then, add to that the fact that I love Whiplash and I've been a fan of jazz music and jazz history for a while. And I love Angel Heart,
Mm-hmm.
which is an Alan Parker, Mickey Rourke, Robert De Niro film. Um, and yeah, all those things, as we discussed before, all those things just kind of came together at one point, and there was an idea that was born.
And when you got started on it, I know I'm I'm bad at remembering names off the top of my head, but your collaborator on the book,
Anand
uh,
Anand Radhakrishnan.
yes,
Yeah,
I know you talked about in other interviews that you guys kind of freestyled, like you would write, he would draw, and it would kind
yeah.
of come together in like like jazz does. Did you guys like start off approaching it that way, or did you kind of start doing traditional and realize it wasn't working, and then went back to doing, or and then fell back on that?
It wasn't a question of it wasn't working really. I mean, we started off doing it more traditionally, but I think because we were trying to do like it, just to describe it to people who haven't seen the book, every page, at least we're trying to be interesting and innovative
Mm-hmm.
in the way it's laid out. You're not going to see, straight up 9-panel grids or everything is widescreen. That's not the case here. Every page is kind of weirdly inventive in ways, and we knew we wanted to do that. And because we were trying to do that, we kind of invariably fell onto this method of working where Anand would do a layout, and then we would sit down and discuss that layout, and he would then go back and create these thumbnails and come back to me, and I'd go like, okay, cool, let's do this. But then we'd make changes there, which would necessarily mean that the next page would have to change. That because we decided to compose this page in one way,
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to go in and change how I'd scripted the next page. And the more often I did that, I realized at some point that it's better for me to just write this page, discuss it with you, have you draw it, me look at that drawn page and go like, okay, this is what comes next.
What
So yeah,
did it feel like freer to do it that way, or was it more stressful to kind of not know what comes next?
I think it was more exciting, but I think it was quite stressful and quite creatively draining,
Yeah.
because I don't know. I can't articulate why it was draining. The only thing I remember distinctly feeling is by the time we got to the end, I had no idea what story I had told.
Yeah.
And it was only people like Aditya who was lettering the book, and so had read the book in its entirety at the end. It's like, Ram, this works. This is a good story. And I would always talk to him like, I don't know, I can't make head or tail of it. I can't make any sense of it because in my head it's just a series of pages,
Yeah.
and I haven't quite written it as a story. And well, I'm thankful that people enjoyed it, and I'm thankful that people thought it was great. But by the time we were done, I was like, I'm not doing this again. I can't even
Yeah.
tell if whatever I've written is good or not yet.
It's so fascinating because like you kind of became your main character near the end, where you kind of just got lost in the medium and and almost self-destructed.
Yeah. I mean, it was nowhere near as hard as what I put the character through,
Yeah,
but
but like
like
yeah, you could.
I didn't end up burning down my house because
No,
I
no,
didn't.
you didn't.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, that's
Spoilers.
fascinating to hear. And now you're doing another music book for Vault, Radio Apocalypse, and that looks
Yeah.
amazing too. It's exciting. And what kind of musical influences are in that book? Can you talk about those at all, or is that spoiler to the
I can't.
story?
I won't discuss the specifics of it. I'll tell you
Yeah,
where the music comes from.
yeah,
Um, so I'll tell you two stories. First of these is the fact that I grew up in India, and in India, the music scene, for whatever reason, has always lagged about 20 years behind where the rest of the world was. At least at that time. I'm sure it's caught up right now.
yeah.
Uh, but at that time, where I was kind of late teens, and I played music, I played guitar, and I was hanging out at rock shows and playing music there. Um, it always seemed to be like a decade or two behind where everyone else was. People were still listening to Iron Maiden and um, sort of classic rock and AC/DC at the end of the 90s in India. And so part of it comes from there.
Yeah.
Um, and the other part of it comes from the idea behind the book, which came to me when I said, okay, if the world were to end next week and I had the opportunity to make a mixtape that I could share with people, what would I put on it? And so all of the songs in Radio Apocalypse are I suppose, from that mixtape. Um, and the way this comic works is a little bit more mechanically sort of intertwined with the music than the other books I've done so far, in that you're supposed to read the book while you listen to the music,
Okay. Yeah.
and you're supposed to pick up the music from visual cues in the book.
Okay.
So the idea is that you are genuinely creating a soundtrack as you read the story,
That's so
and
fascinating.
should be interesting to see how that affects the story. Yeah.
Yeah, because the only other book I could think of that has like a playlist inside of it, but it's always at the end of the book that I you see the playlist is Jeff Lemire's Royal City.
Right.
And so to have it inside the book, and it's like you see that the visual cues is so fascinating. As someone who's a big fan of music and comics, I'm excited
Yeah,
to
yeah,
get to
and
that.
I think it's gonna be a really weird playlist too, because like the songs aren't meant to be played one after the other. They're meant
Yeah,
to go alongside the story. So I don't know if you ever get this, but when you listen to the soundtrack as part of a film, it makes sense.
yeah,
And then you go away, turn off the film, and just listen to the soundtrack. And you're like, this is a really weird collection of songs.
yeah. Yeah. I was just talking soundtracks with a friend, and I was thinking about the Guardians soundtrack. I'm like, this is really just someone's like mixtape that they loved growing up. But when the movie, it all like hits emotional cues. But
Yeah,
listening to it feels
I
like a
mean,
mixtape your friend gave you.
also look at like the new Blade Runner film, right?
Yeah,
If you look at the soundtrack, it's all these like really great Hans Zimmer kind of electronic, deep kind of bass-driven, amazing ambient music, and then it's punctuated by Frank Sinatra
yeah,
singing,
yeah.
and so you're just like, what is going on with this soundtrack? But it makes complete sense in the movie. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's kind of funny. Speaking of Blade Runner, would you ever want to do something like futuristic like that? Because I know Catwoman has from the stuff I've seen, I haven't been able to pick up the Future State Catwoman book yet, but the stuff I've
Right.
seen has a very futuristic Blade Runner to look with Schmidt's work on it. But would you ever want to do something like that?
Well, I already did a book called Paradiso, which was kind of post-apocalyptic future tech-y,
Okay.
and I'm currently doing a book with the artist Evan Cagle, that we haven't announced, so I can't reveal the title for, but I've teased, which is also set in kind of a not quite Blade Runner aesthetic, but definitely a kind of future tech aesthetic to it. So, and I think my next creator-owned project at Image will probably be very much in that sort of retro futurism vibe. So,
And it feels like you're never just like not writing something new, because you do have another new book that was announced too, The Many Deaths of Leela Star, right?
Layla Star,
Layla
yeah,
Star,
yeah.
by Boom. It's like, Rob, how many books can you write? Because you feel like you're writing about 10 books currently.
I don't know, and I always describe this problem to people, and it sounds a little facetious, so I'm careful doing it. But I said yes to a lot of things in 2019, and I didn't quite figure out how I was going to deliver everything that I'd said yes to. And totally understand it's a good problem to have, but it really is like a beginner's problem because uh, I've I only started writing comics seriously in 2016, right? Black
Yeah,
Mamba came out in 2016, so I suppose this is the year that I figure out maybe I shouldn't say yes to so many things at once. Maybe I should pace myself a little bit more. And so, yeah, I'm writing a lot of things. It's not ideal. Ideally, I would like to write maybe one or two things less at any given point in time.
yeah.
But that's a thing to be figured out. Like you have to hit the wall before you know that's your wall. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, no, for sure, and it's exciting too because like as much I love your work so much, I'm excited for a whole year of Rom just going nuts on everything. But I
Well,
do worry about you
you're
hitting that wall.
yeah, you're gonna get a couple of more announcements, so we'll see. We'll see
Um,
how it goes.
before we jump into the question and answer from some listeners,
Yeah.
I'm just curious because we haven't really touched upon it. What do you think is the comic book that like really changed your perspective on comics that really matters to you the most?
Well, I think the one that really changed my perspective on comics was Sandman. Because before Sandman, I had been kind of, I had read comics as a kid, and then when I kind of hit a certain age, my parents took my comics away. They said you can't read them anymore. You have to read real books now, quote
Yeah,
unquote. And that happened, and so I kind of put off comics for a while. And it was reading Sandman that really brought me back to it. I said, "Oh, there's something super interesting going on here that I can't look away from." And it was reading that made me go out and buy pretty much everything else Neil Gaiman had done. And then I read somewhere that Alan Moore had recommended Neil Gaiman to Karen Berger. And so I said, okay, let's find out who this Alan Moore guy is, and then read everything Alan Moore had done. And then just went on from there to like Morrison, Ennis, Ellis, uh, who else? Yeah, pretty much that kind of entire Vertigo canon, really. Brian Azzarello, yeah, him too. So yeah, Sandman had the biggest impact on me. But in terms of books that I draw the most amount of influence from, I think probably 100 Bullets to an extent,
yeah.
a lot of Warren Ellis, a few things that are more European comics, more indie comics than your mainstream stuff. Um, when I first moved to the UK, I started working with a sort of independent digital comics app here, and they had access to a lot of indie comics, non-mainstream stuff in their library, and so I got to read all of that while I was at work, and that was greatly influential in me kind of figuring out what my voice was going to be as well.
And moving on to just some listener questions. Anthony asks, "What's your favorite Justice League Dark member and why?"
What's my favorite Justice League Dark
Member, sorry.
member? Oh, I'd probably say. See, this is a really difficult question because I like each of them for very different reasons.
Yeah,
And so rather than tell you my favorite member, let me tell you why I like each of these characters, right?
that's perfect.
So I like Detective Chimp because I like the idea that the most grounded, wisest, and probably smartest member of that team is the chimp, which
Yeah.
is great. Um, I like Zatanna because there is this kind of sense of discovery with her, where she's always had this trait of not having discovered the extent of her own abilities, and so I think her voice always lends this kind of sense of wonderment and discovery, even with all the stuff that she can do. And as a contrary point to that, I love writing John because here's the guy who's seen everything, right? And so nothing surprises him anymore.
Yeah.
Uh, and kind of writing that cynical, world weary voice is also a super interesting exercise. Um, and I love Fate because he's my big picture guy. He's the one who sees the world in its entirety because of the nature of his powers, and so making Khalid or Kent Nelson that kind of window into the greater wisdom of magic, um, is also an interesting thing to write. So there you go.
And it's so fascinating. The small spoilers for the future state, Justice League Dark, back up the first one at least,
Yeah.
giving Detective Chimp Etrigan because he is so like not wanting to deal with any of that, and to give him like the most consuming spirit to embody him is just the perfect thing.
Also, Etrigan is like incensed and constantly annoyed that he has to
Yeah,
be summoned by this chimp who he clearly thinks is beneath him.
yeah. Like he
Uh,
already didn't like Jason Blood all that much.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I
Um,
thought I thought that was an interesting mechanic to
yeah, I
use,
love that. I love seeing that.
and I must give credit to my editors, Andrea Shea, who also conferred with Brittany Holzer and got that idea. The editors were like super sold on, yes, Detective Chimp and Etrigan, do it.
Yeah, that's
And,
one of my favorite things to come out of Future State so far.
great, I'm glad.
Um, I am sorry before I try to pronounce this name. That if I butcher the name, I'm very sorry. Uh, Arna Ava asks, do you think cast plays or should play a role in your writing? Following up by saying most U.S. writers tend to ignore it, and they just want to know your take on it.
Uh, Cast as in Caste.
Yes.
So he's particularly asking about Indian writing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think it does, and I think you have to be careful writing those stories. Also, because I come from a certain caste in India, and so my view of the caste system is necessarily affected by that,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, I haven't struggled because of my caste.
Yeah.
Um, while I understand that a lot of people have, and so I am of the opinion that whatever I write will never be quite the experience of someone who has actually had to go through that. And so those things, I would much rather hold up someone else to the world and go like, you should listen to this person writing about
Mm-hmm.
caste
Yeah.
because their experiences of it are much more authentic than mine. That said, you can't get away from the caste system in India. It's all pervading and it exists everywhere. And I think many deaths of Layla Starr being set in Mumbai. I know that there's a story in that one in particular where I do touch on my experience of the caste system and how that affected me,
Mm-hmm.
and so in turn how it affects the story and the character in the book. So yeah, so I don't think anything good comes off of ignoring things like caste and race and political structures that exist in society. I think all stories are inherently political, and so we must endeavor not to consciously ignore anything.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you, and I think being able to acknowledge that some areas of whatever privilege that we have is like this is like sometimes it's hard to write about certain things because like we grew up in like for me being just a white guy, it's just like growing up with that privilege is like I can't I can't write certain things because I just don't understand them, and I have to acknowledge that and have
Yeah,
to
I mean,
own
it's
it.
not as much as you can't write versus if your intention is to bring attention to something
Yeah,
through your story, right?
yeah,
Then you really have to question, like, is your voice the most
yeah,
apt voice to tell that story? Like, so many writers, like I don't know, there was a furor about some writer having written about the immigrant experience of someone coming across the border from Mexico into the US, and this person has never actually had to go through that. So
yeah,
what equips them with the necessary authenticity or the ability to transmit that experience to other people, especially when there are people who have gone through that and are writers and are
yeah,
capable of
exactly.
writing those stories better. I can understand if there was no one else to do it, and you said, okay, well, I need to write the story because no one else is writing it. But to write about to write about racial injustice in America as a white person when there are 50, 100, 200 black people who have actually been through that,
Yeah,
wanting to write about it and writing about it, it just strikes me as inauthentic.
no, I totally agree with you. And if you have the power to lift up those voices, why don't you just do that instead?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was this whole again hue and cry about covers in comics, and some comic had some politically charged cover, and their contention was that they were doing it to bring attention to the issue of bigotry in America. Well, if that was your intention, get someone
Yeah.
who's a Muslim artist to draw your cover.
Yep.
Get someone who's from Pakistan to draw your cover, and tell them that you want to bring attention to this issue, and that's why you're hiring them. And I guarantee you, they would have come up with a different cover.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I totally know what you're talking about there, and that whole thing is just always still doesn't sit right with me, and I don't think it ever will sit differently with that person. So yeah. Moving on to something a little less heavy is Jay asks, how do you write a convincing 5-page comic for anthologies? And if you can, talk about your process on that.
Sorry, what was the question again?
How do you write a convincing 5-page comic for anthologies? And if you can go into it at all, the process of writing something that small.
Well, two things there. When you have such a low page count, you're trying to make an impact in a very limited real estate that's available to you. And so I tend to think of those stories more as moments
Yeah.
rather than stories. So more like vignettes or flash fiction rather than a short story or a long form novel, if you will. Um, and so the first part of that process is to really think about and arrive at a moment in your story that encapsulates everything that you want to say. And unless you can do that, then I worry that you don't really have a 5 pager. You have something that needs to be a 20 pager that you're going to try and cram into five, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is to understand that all stories have shape and structure and dramatic tension. Controlling dramatic tension in your story is what you're doing when you design pages or when you design a plot. And as long as whether you're doing a 50-page thing or a 5-page thing, as long as you're aware of structural changes in dramatic tension while you're doing that, then you will end up writing something good. So um, yeah, encapsulate your story in a impactful moment, and then write the 5 pages following an idea of structure to highlight that moment, I suppose.
And then lastly, there's 3 questions by a friend of the show, Sheen Dillon, who asks, what historical events, figures would you like to write a whole comic about?
Um, I don't know. I haven't thought of any in particular in terms of historical figures. Um, there is a there's a crime lord who lived in Mumbai. There was a crime lord who lived in Mumbai called Varadaraj Mudliar, who was the subject of um, one of India's most famous crime films. There was a film called Nayakan that came out, and it had one of my favorite Indian actors in it as well. Kamal Hassan played the titular character. Um, I would love to do a closer to reality graphic novel adaptation of that. Um, so much that I have actually tried to reach out to Compass and at one point we gone like, let me tell this story because it is amazing.
Yeah,
But that's besides the point. I suppose I don't know if that qualifies as a historical figure
I think it does.
because
Yeah.
yeah, cool.
If there's history to them and wherever they're from, I think it counts as a historical figure. And then another question by Sean is asking, which one of your books do you think more people would talk about?
um, I don't know that I really think about my books that way. That I wish more people would talk about this one or that one. I like there's a level of
Hmm.
detachment that comes over me once the book has left my desk, which is not entirely good because I'm like, yeah, it's out there. I don't need to do anything about it. Well, which is actually the time I need to talk about it more and push it and make sure people see the book,
Yeah.
which I do to a large extent, but I really don't spend too much time thinking about like, oh, I wish people had read Paradiso more, or I wish people had read Black Mamba more, or whatever it is. Like the story has a life of it, and the book has a life of its own once it has left my desk.
And lastly, which non-comic book would you recommend to people who like your work?
I'd recommend rather than books, I'd recommend writers.
Yeah.
Um, I'd recommend Paul Auster, who is a huge influence on me and my work. Um, I'd recommend Murakami, who's a huge influence on my
I'm
work. I'd
literally reading a
recommend,
Murakami book right now. Like that's what one of the novels I'm working through right now.
yeah. Well, let me know if you see any thematic similarities. Um, and yeah, and then I'd recommend Michael Chabon, who's also
Yeah, Michael
one of
Chabon's
my
great.
favorite writers. Yeah.
Ram, thank you so much for like joining me on the show and talking about all this stuff with me. Where can people find you on
My
Twitter,
pleasure.
and which books are coming out next?
You can find me on Twitter at the right Rom, and Twitter is probably the most likely place where I'm active. And as far as books coming out next, well, it's February, and so Future State Round Two is out. So Swamp Thing, Future State Justice League Dark, which is part of the Future State Justice League book, and Catwoman Future State will also be out in Feb. And then starting March, um, Swamp Thing, the Swamp Thing #1 comes out in March, which is issue one of a 10 issue season. And if the 10 issues do well, we get to do another season, so on and so forth. So if you're listening, go order that book. And of course, again, starting in March, the ongoing runs will continue, i.e., I'll be writing Catwoman, I'll be writing Justice League Dark. Apart from that, creator-owned books were announced: Radio Apocalypse, Many Deaths of Layla Starr, that we spoke about. I've got one more creator-owned thing that will probably get announced later this year. I'm also writing a Carnage short story for Marvel, which is in the April solicits for Carnage Red, White, and Blood. And that's about everything on my plate right now.
That's still so much though. And lastly, you can find this show at Comics Matter Pod on Twitter. Everything else will be in the description of the episode. And remember to try to get some water in today. Try to drink some water today. Everybody needs to remember to do that.